Okay, I'm now recording. So I'm going to be talking about plant anatomy. And in the previous section, when we were talking about how plants grow, I mentioned that there was sort of a growth cycle that starts with seeds, which then turn into roots and leaves and stems and flowers, and then eventually fruit and the seeds again. So those are kind of the basic overall parts of plants that we're going to look at each of those systems in a little more detail today. And I brought some plants that we'll be specifically looking at. There are also a lot of good diagrams out there. If you want to look up plant parts in a diagram, there are a lot of good ones out there that will just kind of lay things out. If you're more of a visual learner, that will kind of give you some things to look at as far as the different parts of plants go. So when people are looking at plants, flowers are kind of the most showy part of plants a lot of the time. And that's not true of every plant, but in general, people often recognize plants by their flowers. If you look at a sunflower, you're gonna know what it is by looking at the flower. If you look at a dandelion, you probably recognize the flower very easily. And often people will get confused because there are a couple other plants that are different plants, but that have very similar looking flowers, like sow thistle, which is blooming right now, which has kind of the same flower as a dandelion, but instead of being close to the ground, it's on a tall branch stem, and the leaves look kind of like dandelion leaves. There's also groundsel, which can look like a tiny dandelion. There's coltsfoot, which looks like a dandelion with a scaly stem and no leaves. So there are various different things that you would want to look at to be able to differentiate one plant from the other. And that's really sort of the purpose of learning plant anatomy, is to be able to differentiate between similar plants. Without learning plant anatomy, you would have a lot of plants you could recognize pretty easily, just kind of visually, the way that you recognize other people. You might just see certain features and be able to be like, okay, that's a sunflower, or that's an aloe plant. It looks pretty distinctive. Although, there are other things that look like aloe plants that aren't too. And there are different types of aloe plants that you might not be able to differentiate between if you didn't familiarize yourself with the details first. So this is going to be something that if you're coming on the plant walk with us on Saturday, you'll get a chance to see more about what I'm talking about. And it's a skill that will help you in being able to identify plants and in being able to look up plants, use a field guide, things like that. A lot of people lately use apps for identifying plants, and some of them are pretty good. There's one called iNaturalist that's kind of constantly updated by people using it. And it's reasonably accurate, but it's not always right. And it's important to be able to check what it's telling you. It's important to be able to, and it's also important to be able to know what plants are just visually without having to look them up every time too, which is something that you come to eventually, but that really informs your understanding of plant communities and ecosystems that you find yourself in. By just being able to not have to scan or look up each plant individually, but being able to look around and see what's around you at a glance. The same way that you would if you were in a field full of animals. Humans are a lot more used to looking at animals, right? So, even when we're very small children, you'd probably know the difference between a dog and a pig, maybe even between a dog and a fox, just by looking at them. Or a sheep and a goat. Those two can be kind of confusing, but most people fairly early on know how to tell the difference between your standard looking sheeps and goats. There's some weird ones like Soay sheep that are a little more goat looking, but for the most part. People can tell animals apart. You don't usually see somebody like having to look up whether something is a horse or a cow based on how many hooves it has at the end of each foot. We just we look at them and we know what they look like. And if you're not already to that point with plants, you'll get there pretty quickly once you start to learn to identify them. But at first, you kind of have to do the little more painstaking work of being able to look at plants anatomically and see what different distinguishing features they might have. And I think it bears saying that even people who are really experienced with plants won't always know every plant that they come across. There are definitely times when I'm out in the woods and somebody says, "What's this plant?" And I'm like, "I have no idea what that is." Not so many times anymore, but there are certain plants that I'm very familiar with because I use them a lot. There are other plants that I'm not very familiar with because I don't use them very much. And sometimes there are new plants that come into our ecosystem that didn't used to be things you would find wherever you are. To give an example from around here, there's a plant called Italian arum. And the first time I saw it in the wild, it's a house plant, but it has berries. And if it's out on a porch or something and birds eat the berries, they can distribute those seeds, and sometimes it comes up. I'm not sure exactly why. I never saw it before a few years ago, but I never had. And that might just be because we've had, kind of a series of warmer and warmer years. And so maybe the environment has been better for it, or maybe it wasn't a popular houseplant and then it was, or maybe both. But in any case, I first saw it in a city park growing in the woods, in the wooded area of a city park, about 4 years ago or so. And my thought at the time was, oh, maybe, this was somebody's house plant and they didn't want to throw it out. So they came and buried it in the woods and it kept growing. But then more and more people started reporting this plant in the wild as a weed, as an invasive species. It's not necessarily very invasive, or maybe it is, I don't know yet, but it is, it is a berry. So plants with berries can become invasive a lot more easily because they have the birds to eat them and replant them. In any case, it's a new plant in the ecosystem. It didn't used to be here. It's similar in appearance to a plant, Jack in the Pulpit, that has been here all along, but it looks a little bit different. And if you didn't know about what you were looking at, you might think, oh, that's a weird looking Jack in the Pulpit. I wonder what's wrong with it. But if you know what to look for, you can see that it's actually not a Jack in the Pulpit, it's something else. So, don't expect to know every plant, but the more you learn, the easier it is to learn new ones, and the larger of a base of information you're going to have for looking around at your ecosystems around you and feeling and intuitively understanding what is going on in those ecosystems. So there are a lot of different kinds of plants, right? So a lot of the herbs that we use are flowering plants. There are some herbs that we use that are not flowering plants. There's medicinal mushrooms, which are kind of a whole separate thing from what I'm going to be talking about today. But then there's also ferns, for example. Ferns work pretty differently from flowering plants. They still have leaves, stems, and roots. They don't really have flowers. They don't really have seeds. They have spores, and sometimes they have other structures that help them get around or make more of themselves. So they're kind of different. Pine trees, conifer trees, they have not exactly fruit and flowers, but they have similar structures. They have cones, which are sort of like fruit. They're the structures that hold the seeds. The difference being that in a cone, the seed can be exposed directly to the environment instead of completely enfolded in some kind of capsule. And The flowers, they don't really have flowers. They just have the male cones that distribute pollen and the female cones that collect the pollen and then turn into the seed bearing structures. They develop the seeds. So kind of a different setup, but similar in a lot of ways. And then there's the flowering plants, which is most of the herbs that people use medicinally, are plants that have flowers, we might call angiosperms, and that have fruit of some sort. You know, keep in mind that a fruit or a flower does not always look like what we typically think of, like an apple or a rose or something like that as being a flower or a fruit. They don't always look like that. Sometimes they're much more nondescript or smaller, or, you know, a lot of them are not really set up to interest human beings at all. They're set up to interest insects. So some of them are very tiny, and I'll kind of show you more about that. And some of them are set up to distribute their pollen on the wind or catch pollen from the wind. And there are a lot of different variations on flowers. There are a lot of different variations on leaves too. There are different variations in shape, texture, and a lot of other things. But I'm going to start out talking about flowers first. So this is one of the bigger flowers that grows around here. This is a magnolia. And magnolias are kind of almost like a benchmark in plant anatomy, because a lot of plants would be considered or categorized based on how close they are structurally and genetically to a magnolia. So we would describe some plants as being magnolia phytes, which means that they're kind of laid out along the same lines as a magnolia is. In this case, with the magnolia, you can see it has very obvious petals, the big white parts, and then in the middle of that, it has the pistils, which collect pollen and will become the fruits. And it also has the pollen producing parts. And so that's kind of like what everybody thinks of when they think of a flower, right? Is something along those lines. It's got the yellow center, and then it's got the big colorful, in this case, white, cream colored petals. So that's one kind of flower. This is another setup. This is watercress. And watercress is a member of the mustard family. And let's see if I can get this close to the camera. Where exactly is it? It's hard to see where the camera is. As you can see, it has 4 petals on each flower. People used to call this plant family crucifery, which means cross bearers, because they have these 4 petals arranged at right angles to each other, kind of like a cross. And then so rather than just having one big flower, it has a cluster of little flowers, an inflorescence containing several small flowers all bunched together. Another example of this, a very closely related plant, is broccoli. You all know what broccoli looks like, right? It's just like this big lump of little green balls. And if you cut the stem and you put it in water, those little green buds turn into flowers. So the bud is what the flower is before it opens up. So in broccoli, those turn into little yellow flowers that are shaped just like this. And they actually taste kind of similar too. So they're all clustered together. And then this one is watercress. Watercress was also a food crop It's not native to this area. It was brought here and planted by people as food. And then it kind of fell out of fashion as a food, and people don't really plant it as much anymore, but it keeps growing. And so here in central Kentucky, we have a lot of waterways that are kind of filtered by the limestone, the bedrock that the water flows through, and watercress really likes those places. So this one was growing in a drainage ditch a few meters from my clinic. And so watercress is a very nutritious plant, but you shouldn't ever eat it if it's growing in water that you wouldn't drink, because it's typically eaten raw. So eating the plant is just like drinking the water, you know, and if it's contaminated with runoff or anything like that, you wouldn't want to. But you can see it has these flowers, and each of the flowers is on a tiny little stem-like structure. And each of these flowers will turn into a seed. And the seeds of these kind of plants in the mustard family are just like a very tiny round ball, sometimes inside of a little pod. And then when the pod breaks open, there will be a seed, or in depending on the plant, a few seeds in each one. Well, just a moment. Okay, so when you're looking at plants, when you're trying to look up a plant, some of the things that you'll want to look up about, that you'll want to keep in mind about the flower, is what color it is. That's often a very noticeable thing, and sometimes it's a strong guide to what the plant is, and sometimes it's not. There are many plants that have that always have the same color of flower, and there are many plants where the flower will vary somewhat, say maybe between white and pink or white and blue. So you know, that's something to look at, what color the flower is. That's something that you can see from, you know, way across the field. Often before you can even get close enough to tell what kind of flower it is, you can see, oh, there's a bunch of yellow flowers out in that field. And then as you get closer to them, maybe you'll recognize that they're buttercups. And then when you get down and look at the shape of the leaf, maybe you'll figure out what kind of buttercup. But the color of the flower is one of the first things you want to notice. The next thing about the flower that you might take note of, that a field guide or key might use as a guideline for figuring out what the plant is how many petals it has. Magnolia, the number of petals is kind of variable. It has several of them. It has a bunch of them. Maybe it will have 7. Maybe it will have 5. Maybe it will have 9. With the watercress, it's always 4. I mean, if something comes up and bites it off, it's not. But other than that, they consistently have 4 petals for each flower. And if you see that they're white, you can tell it's watercress. If you see a very similar plant with yellow flowers, that one's not watercress. That's landcress or wintercress, something like that. So that's something that you will often look at with flowers: how many petals they have and what color they are. Often, with a whole lot of plants out there, flowers will look something like this. You wouldn't necessarily look at that and be like, oh, look, it's a flower. Actually, these ones haven't all the way opened yet, so maybe you would call them buds, but they're still the flowering part of the plant. This is plantain, one of the plants we talked about before. And it has these long stems with a flower on it. So the flowering stem is often sort of its own thing. Now on the magnolia is a tree. And so the flowers are on the branches of the tree. They're not on the trunk of the tree, they're out on the branches. With the watercress, you have flowers and leaves on a stem. And then you also have leaves that are not part of the flowering stem. But the flowering stem does put out leaves. On the plantago, you just have the leaves all at the base. Let me see if I can separate out a chunk of it here for you to look at. So you would have all the leaves are coming out from in a sort of a circle around the base. So this is called the basal rosette, which just means that it's an arrangement of leaves pointing in all directions from the center that the stem is coming up out of. So that's what you have with plantago, and with many other plants. And then the stem that the flower is on doesn't contain any leaves. Now with these little cone-like flowering inflorescences, flower heads, this is actually a bunch of different little flowers, and the flowers just kind of look like a papery scale. They don't really have a lot of anything all that flashy or showy or colorful to them, and a lot of plants don't. And sometimes that's because they're not attracting insects, and sometimes it's because they are attracting insects but not visually. So bees do land on plantain flowers, but they're not showy. They don't have a lot of color to them or anything like that. So that's not necessarily what we're used to thinking of before we start thinking a lot about plants when we hear about flowers, but that is like, that's actually a cluster of small flowers. So with some flowers, you get kind of a discrete single big flower. And then with some flowers like the watercress, you'll get a cluster of small flowers that you can still look at and see each of these is an individual flower, and they have petals around a central part that has the reproductive organs in it, the reproductive structures in it. And that's a common setup, but this is also a pretty common setup where you'll have just a cluster of things all together. And you would see this in a sunflower too, for instance. The rays of the sunflower surround that central disc, but each of the sections of the central disc is a separate flower that produces a separate seed. So when you talk about a sunflower, it's actually a composite flower consisting of hundreds of little flowers that don't really look like what we think of flowers as looking like. So that's a common setup too. There are many weedy and medicinal plants and many ornamental plants and crop plants that are composite flowers that all cluster together in the central, have a central disc with a cluster of small flowers. Daisies are another example of that. So that there are a lot of them, and those are all different types of flowers. There are a lot of different shapes of inflorescences too. For example, you can have a long, skinny cluster of flowers, or you can have a more umbrella-shaped cluster of flowers, which you might call an umbel, the way that you would see in Queen Anne's lace, for instance. Queen Anne's lace, which you might be familiar with the look of, also known as wild carrot, is it's like a little umbrella-shaped cluster of tiny white flowers. So how the flowers are arranged when there are multiple flowers is another way that you would differentiate one set of plants from another. So that's something else to be aware of, is the arrangement of the flowers. So the color of the flowers, number of petals, the arrangement, and the structure of the flowers are all things that you want to be aware of when you're looking at new plants and trying to figure out what they are. And also when you're describing plants to yourself and trying to make yourself remember the plant, it's good to do it in terms of things like that, so that you can tell for sure, so that if you see one later that's similar in some respects but not others, you can maybe have some basis for knowing that it's a different thing. So next I wanted to talk some about leaves. Like I talked about in the section about how plants grow, leaves are the plant's energy collecting system. They catch the sunlight and they transform it into caloric energy. Well, they transform it from radiant energy into stored energy in the form of sugars and starches and sometimes other substances. So this is from the magnolia again. And just like the flower, this is kind of what the most stereotypical idea of a leaf would be. If you said that something was leaf shaped, this is probably what you meant. You probably wouldn't say something was leaf shaped if it was, say, completely circular, even though there are leaves that are pretty close to circular, or, shaped like an oak leaf or something like that. If somebody says that an object was leaf shaped, this is probably about what they would mean. With just about every kind of leaf out there, there is a very distinct top of the leaf and an underside of the leaf. Top of the leaf is usually shinier. Underside of the leaf might be fuzzy, might just be kind of more dull, have more, sometimes there will be hairs on the underside of the leaf. Magnolias have a very, very fine fuzz on the underside of their leaves, or almost like a velvety, felty type texture. But there are a lot more. This side is more set up for having the rain fall on it, so it's kind of waxed, you might say. It's got shiny surface. That's not true of every leaf. Some leaves are fuzzy all over, right? But for many leaves, they'll be shinier on the top, less shiny on the bottom. So you want to look at the shape of a leaf. You want to be able to look at how the veins are arranged on the leaf. I don't know if you can really see it on here, but let's see. On looking at the underside of both of these leaves, this is the magnolia and this is the plantain. They both have veins. In the magnolia, you have a central midrib, and then you have veins going in different directions from that, kind of going out this way and going out this way. And in the plantago, you have all the veins running along the length. You have several ribs running along the length of the leaf. And that's often what you'll see in grasses, in palm trees, in a lot of different plants, in lilies and orchids. A lot of the time you'll have what's called parallel venation, where just the veins run along the length of the leaf instead of branching out throughout the leaf. The main larger veins. There are smaller ones that do branch out throughout the whole surface. In ferns, the veins look completely different. They're not really even quite the same type of structure. But you know, in a lot of plants, you'll have one of these two basic setups, and these are both what you might call simple leaves. The leaf just consists of one leaf part. Now, if you look at some other plants, which you don't really have a good example of here, you'll have what are called compound leaves, where you'll have each leaf is made up of small leaflets. So for example, in poison ivy, which a lot of people might be familiar with the look of, you'll have the petiole, the stem that the leaf is on, will have 3 different small leaflets on it. Now, when it loses its leaves in the fall, that whole thing falls off together. It's all one leaf. It all is coming from one leaf bud or leaf scar falling off and leaving one leaf scar behind. But it's it looks like 3 small leaves together. So that's a compound leaf consisting of leaflets. Beans, plants in the bean family often have that kind of a setup. You'll have a leaf consisting of several leaflets opposite from each other on the same leaf stem. So those are compound leaves. These are simple leaves. So compound versus simple leaves will make a big difference in what plant you're looking at. We also might describe leaves as by the margins. So this leaf, the edge of the leaf is, in this case, is just smooth. You know, it's slightly wavy, but it doesn't have any serrations. It doesn't have any teeth to it. Sometimes you'll have something like an elm tree, which will have a similar shaped leaf roughly, but it'll have a toothed margin where there's little pointy indentations all along it. Sometimes you'll have a spiny margin, like on a holly leaf, where there's actual spines coming out of the margin of the leaf. So those are some other things that you want to look at. The margin of the leaf, whether it's hairy or smooth, whether it is succulent. If not that many plants around here are succulent. Succulents tend to often live in arid environments, but there are succulents that grow here in Kentucky in wet places as well. Purslane is one that grows a lot in the city and in rocky places. There's one called sedum, or actually there are a couple kinds called sedum or stonecrop. I think we have 3 or 4 different species of stonecrop that grow here. They grow on rocks and they have thick, juicy leaves, sort of like what an aloe or a cactus would have. So those are succulents. Most plants are not. Often leaves are also what might be described as lobed or deeply lobed. So in this case, this plant the watercress has very deeply lobed leaves. They have different sections. They're not quite compound leaves, but they are, deeply sectioned off from each other. An oak leaf would, well, in most species of oak, would also often be lobed, would have places where the edges, the margins curve in. And so, that's a different thing that you would look at, whether the leaves are lobed or whether they have margins are entire, simple. So those are some Here's an example of an oak leaf, and you can see that it has, it's all one leaf, but it has some deep separation in the sections of the leaf. So here, so you can see, and then with oak in particular, one of the things that you'll look at is, do the lobes end in a little tiny bristle, a little tiny pointy spot, or are they rounded at the end? And so that's kind of two whole different categories of oaks, you might say. The ones where the tips of the lobes end in a point or a bristle, and ones where it's rounded at the end. There are a few kinds of oaks that don't actually have lobes at all, but almost all the ones that grow around here, that you usually see around here, do. So another thing that we would talk about we would look at with plants is the habit of the plant. And the habit is kind of like what sort of plant it is. Like, is it a tree? Is it a shrub? Is it a vine? Is it a woody vine or a herbaceous vine? Is it, sometimes people use the term herb, sometimes people use the term forb, or a herbaceous plant, just, a plant that doesn't have any wood to it. So these are all different types of habits of plants. Sometimes people use the term subshrub to mean something that's in between a forb and a shrub. And then sometimes people will make a distinction between a dwarf tree versus a shrub. There's not really a super clear deciding line between what's a tree and what's a shrub or a bush. But generally, we understand things that have a single stem that goes a good ways up off the ground to be a tree, even though sometimes some plants like mulberries, for instance, will grow one big trunk, but if that big trunk is cut down, they'll send up a bunch of little trunks that don't grow very tall, and that's basically a bush. Habit. So yeah, habit is just like it. I mean, in general usage, the term habit means like a tendency, but in plants, it's sort of like you could think of it as being like the body style. Like with vehicles, we would talk about whether something was a car or a truck or a station wagon. It's kind of that sort of thing, but with plants. So we just call it the habit, and it just sort of means which of the types of plants it is as far as its structure and how it grows. So, yeah, like trees, bushes, vines, and so forth. So that's something that is, usually very obvious when you're looking at plants, but there's sometimes things that are similar, or that might look similar, where if you weren't used to looking at them, that might be like a deciding factor. And a good example of that might be elderberry versus valerian. If you see them when they're in flower, they have similar shape of inflorescences. They have similar shape of leaves. They even kind of smell similar. But valerians aren't woody. The valerian plant isn't woody, so the tree is. And then, of course, when they go to fruit, they're nothing alike. One of them has purple berries and the other one just has seeds. But at certain stages of the growth and so forth, that might be the deciding factor, or the thing that helps you to separate out one from another by looking at them. And sometimes that's variable. For example, to use poison ivy again, poison ivy is normally a vine. Under the right circumstances, it will actually grow as a bush until it finds something that it can climb up. So if it's just in a field that's been mowed and maybe doesn't have any trees growing in it and stuff like that. Poison ivy will sometimes grow as a bush. And then once trees start growing in that field, it'll grow up those trees. So it hasn't forgotten that it's a vine. It's just kind of doesn't have anything to climb on. So it looks more like a bush. And, like I said, mulberries can be pruned so that they're bushes. So can willows, so can hazelnuts. And all of those things can be trees. Even lindens, which can be very massive trees. They're kind of probably the closest thing we have around here to a baobab tree. They're in the mallow family, both baobabs and linden trees. But there's a linden tree here in Lexington that's one of the biggest ones of its species in the world, and it's in a cemetery, and it's about 24 feet around the trunk. It's about as wide as the length of a 2x4, so it's about 8 feet wide. So it's a really massive tree. But I've seen that same species of tree growing as a bush, where there was a trunk getting started, and that got cut down, and several small trunks sprouted from the not very big yet root system, and it looks just like a large bush. So sometimes habit is flexible, but it does have a tendency in many cases to be something fairly specific to a type of plant. You won't find any dandelions growing as vines or trees. It's always this herbaceous plant. So that's another kind of deciding factor of plants. And then along with, and a big part of what makes the habit what it is the stem. So the stem of the plant is something else that you look at. Is the stem woody or is it herbaceous? That's one of the things you would look at. Sometimes stems are square. We usually think of stems as being round. In some cases, they're square. Mints have square stems, for instance. Just about nearly everything in the mint family has a squarish stem with distinct sides and corners. The stem has a square cross section. Sometimes stems are hairy or not hairy. A good example around here of that would be Queen Anne's lace and poison hemlock. Poison hemlock has a lot of differences from Queen Anne's lace, but they are closely related plants, and they both have a lot of features in common. They both have white umbels, the umbrella-shaped clusters of flowers. They both have finely divided leaves, and they're both tall plants that grow in unmowed fields and roadsides and things like that. The poison hemlock is much taller at its tallest, but it doesn't always grow to its tallest. So the size range overlaps somewhat. But poison hemlock always has a smooth stem. Queen Anne's lace, wild carrot, whatever you want to call it, always has a hairy stem. So that's something that you can look at to tell them apart. Now, just because it has a hairy stem doesn't necessarily mean that it's Queen Anne's lace, because there are other things like fool's parsley that do have a little bit of a hairy stem too, that are similar and don't share that feature. But that's a way that you can tell if something has a smooth blotched purple and green stem instead of a fuzzy green stem. You can tell that the smooth blotched purple one is poison hemlock and not wild carrot. So are there hairs on the stem? You also might see some other features on the stem like thorns or prickles.
Hey, Andrew.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to add to your poison hemlock comment. We have like a whole field, unfortunately for us, of poison hemlock. But I got brave and I broke one apart, and actually, the stem, it's on the inside, it's hollow, and then it's fibery, which I found kind of interesting,
Yeah.
because looking at it, it looks like it would just be a solid stalk, but
Oh,
when you
right.
break it apart, it's not. I just found that interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And you'll see those stems if you go back and look in the wintertime, you'll see those hollow stems still there sometimes. They persist and they're just kind of like hollow tubes. Uh, but yeah, and it tends to be much bigger, in general. But yeah, so the stem is something that you can look at, and whether the stem is hollow, whether it contains pith, or whether it's solid all the way through, are also things that you might look at uh, among different plants, and how the leaves attach to the stems. So there are a lot of plants where you can say, okay, this leaf wraps around the stem at the base, or that the leaf is on a distinct stem that comes away from the main stem, a little peel that comes away from the main stem. So, how the leaf attaches to the stem can be a very good way to determine one plant from another sometimes. So, and that's something to be aware of and to look at. If we go out in the woods, if you come with me out to the fields this weekend, we will probably see two plants, one of which is sow thistle and one of which is wild lettuce. I use wild lettuce medicinally, and I don't use sow thistle medicinally. But one of the easiest ways for a new person to tell them apart is by how the leaf attaches to the stem. So it can be a pretty good diagnostic feature. And then how much the stem branches can be another thing that you would look at with the stem. And of course, the color of the stem. There's sometimes different features of the texture. For example, some stems have sort of wings to them where they have a little flap of leafy or cork-like material that sticks out from the wing, in a wing shape from the stem. A good example of that would be sweet gum trees, which you can look up pictures of. They have what are called cork wings. There's another plant called wing stem that has the same type of feature. Well, a similar type of feature. So those are all different things to look at. That's part of leaf shape. Sometimes the leaf will be round or have a round cross section. That's kind of the usual thing. Sometimes it will have grooves that run the length of the stem so that the cross section is more like star shaped. And that's another pair that we'll probably see when we go out in the woods or in the fields this weekend is blackberry versus black raspberry. And of the ones that grow around here, one of the easiest ways you can tell them apart is by looking at the stem. And especially because the stem persists all year, whereas the leaves and the fruit do not. You can tell what kind of fruit's going to grow on it by looking at the stem. And so that's not true with every species of blackberry and raspberry, but it's true with the common ones that are here. As it turns out, blackberry and raspberry are more of a culinary or the distinction is not necessarily a genetic one. There are some raspberries that are closer related to blackberries than they are to other raspberries. So it's not necessarily really a genetic category. It's more like a feature as to how the berry detaches from the stem, pulling off entirely instead of taking a little bit of stem with it. So that's but we'll probably look at some of these this weekend and kind of look at differences with the stem. And the texture of the stem can also include if the stem is waxy, if it has bark. Some stems, even among herbaceous plants, have a bark or cortex that's very distinct from the rest of the stem. Some kind of just feel like they don't have like a thick bark. They have a skin, they have an epidermis, but they don't have a thick bark. So that's something that we might also see some differences between while we're out. And let's see. So that's basically the stem for you. There are also some other stem-like structures. There are runners, which kind of are stem branches that run along the ground, and then the buds from those stems put down new roots and leaves to start a new plant. Strawberries are a very familiar thing that grows with the use of runners. Some grasses have a similar setup. So that's a stem feature. There are also rhizomes. Rhizomes are an underground part of the plant. And so that brings us kind of into the underground section of things. Because a lot of the medicines that we harvest are underground. And so, like I mentioned before, rhizomes are actually part of the stem that grows under the ground, or they're a stem type of structure that grows under the ground. They're considered part of the root system, often referred to by the name rootstock. So when somebody is digging up bloodroot or golden seal root, a big part of what they're getting is actually underground stems. Whereas, with ginseng, it's actually the tap root. It's more properly a root. Ginger is a rhizome. Carrots are a root. So the way that if something is growing more like ginger, that's a rhizome. If it's more like carrot, that's a root. It's kind of an example that you can see from the produce section of plants that most of us would be familiar with prior to the study of herbal medicine. So, and then the roots might have different structures or setups. For example, being a tap root or being a bunch of small spindly roots. That can be a different type of thing that you might look at to differentiate some plants from each other, or to talk about, to identify a plant. You might say, okay, the root is a tap root, a large tap root. That can be a hint as to what the plant is. So all of those things are, in very non-jargony language, things that we might look at to tell one plant from another. And if you get a field guide, which if you haven't gotten one yet, I strongly encourage it. It will usually have some pictures that illustrate these things and different leaf shapes and so forth. And so that's a really good thing to familiarize yourself with, so that you can, start using whatever field guide you get. Some of them are set up. They're set up in different ways. Peterson's field guides are my favorite. And they kind of usually go by the color of the flower, and then within that, how many petals it has. And then within that, each different plant will have a description that should help you to differentiate it from the other plants that are similar. And sometimes plants can be, similar enough that it doesn't really matter from an herbal medicine point of view very much. I mentioned oak trees before. There are hundreds of species of oak trees. I can't always tell them apart, or maybe I don't even know that the certain species exists in some cases. The common ones around here I do know, just mostly from long use. But even when I didn't have that depth of knowledge, I knew what oak bark was for. And so it didn't make as much difference what kind of tree I was getting the oak bark from, with the exception that the ones that have these bristles at the end tend to have more intensely astringent bark than the ones that are rounded at the end. And so I usually went for the ones with the rounded lobes for medicine, instead of the ones with the bristled lobes. just because it's kind of milder and more easily tolerated. I usually use oak bark topically, so it doesn't make much difference at all. Oak bark internally is kind of, you know, okay, so oak bark internally is something that you might use to induce vomiting. It's not something that I've used very often at all in my practice, although I do keep it in the medicine wagon during festivals and stuff like that, just in case there's a need to do such a thing. But you know, like I said, I've hardly ever had to use it for that purpose. People, yeah, don't usually come to me with the complaint of having taken too much medicine or anything like that. You know, they usually would go to an emergency room for that sort of thing. So anyway, oak bark internally is emetic, and externally it's astringent. Usually I'm using it as an astringent. It's also good for turning hides into leather, but that's kind of a whole different skill set. So yeah, sometimes you don't need to know down to the species what a plant is. Sometimes you do. Sometimes it makes a big difference, and sometimes it doesn't. So sometimes it's just enough to know what type of plant you have in general. And sometimes the distinctions that people make between different species are fairly artificial distinctions. You know, there's not always like a clear-cut case of when something is one species or another, and not always a clear, sometimes different experts will disagree on whether something is a breed within a species or whether it's a separate species. So that's something, you know, that sometimes matters more from other perspectives than it does from a medicinal perspective, like certain trees producing a different quality of lumber, for instance. But yeah, if you know something's an oak tree, they're all going to have pretty similar medicinal properties. Poison oak is not an oak tree. It's a completely different thing. But white oak and black oak and red oak and scarlet oak and chinkapin oak and willow oak and live oak, they're all pretty similar medicinally. You know, it's kind of like the difference between different types of wines or something like that. There are variations, but they all do the same general sort of thing. So mostly with that, we've talked about flowering plants. With ferns, you get the different fronds. They tend to be, you know, compound, but some of them look different than the stereotypical fern shape. Some of them have almost vine-like habit. Some of them are will have a particular color or hairiness of stem. Some of them have a distinctive scent to them. So there are a lot of different things that you can look at to differentiate one from another, or how whether the leaves are singly divided or divided, and then each of those bits are divided further. That's another thing that you would look at with those. With gymnosperms, with conifers, you'd kind of have different, although all the leaves tend to be, not all, mostly the leaves are needles. Some of them are short, some of them are compound. For example, hemlock trees have very small cones. They have compound needles instead of single needles, and the cones are more like a regular scale type cone rather than a fleshy red aril like what a yew tree would have. So those are two things that yew and hemlock both grow in the woods here. It would be possible to mistake them for one another, especially when the hemlock tree is small. It grows into a gigantic tree, whereas the yew tree is basically more like a bush, sometimes even like a ground cup or like a yeah, woody, shrubby ground cover, but they have similar looking leaves, and especially when they're small, you might be able to mistake them for one another. Although with you, the leaves are darker and they don't have as distinctive an underside and upper side. So there'll still be some ways to differentiate them. They taste very different, but that's not a good indicator, because the reason that they taste different is because the yew is so poisonous, and you put it in your mouth, it really tastes bitter and poisonous from the alkaloids. So that's one way to tell them apart, but it's not necessarily the most highly recommended way to tell them apart from one another. Just a second. Yeah, Gretchen mentions the watercress at Climax Springs is a good place to eat it. And if I'm going to eat watercress at all, that's usually where I would get it from, is from a spring that has good, clean water. Because if you find it growing in a ditch or, well, obviously an urban runoff type of situation is not what you want at all. But even if it were in a stream that had cow pastures along it, for instance, it would still be contaminated with the runoff from the cow pastures, and you don't want that. But if it's coming out of a spring, that's especially a spring like Climax that's regularly getting tested for water quality, then that's wonderful and safe and good. And like I said, it's actually a crop that just self seeds. It's not all that invasive, really, but it will grow if it's let to. It will grow, get into waterways and grow there, sometimes for decades and generations if it's not disturbed. But it's pretty easy to get rid of if you want to get rid of it too. If you think, okay, I don't want this watercress in my stream anymore because it's keeping some other plant from growing, and you pull it out, it'll try coming back for a couple years, because there will be some seeds in the mud that try to come back up. But it's not very, it's not super persistent the way that some of its land growing relatives are. So all of those are different ways of looking at plants. And then another thing that I haven't really talked about so far is the fruits. Fruits, in botanical terms, is any kind of seed containing structure from a flowering plant. So that can include seeds, grains. I mean, it can include things like nuts and acorns that we don't usually think of as fruit when we're talking of fruit in terms of, as food. And then it also does include, soft, fleshy fruits as well. So there are some different types of fruits: nuts, nutlets, berries, drupes, which are sort of like a single seed encased in a fleshy coating. Sometimes there are clusters of drupes, like mulberries, that have a bunch of those. We would call it a berry in terms of eating it, but in terms of its botanical structure, it's not a berry. So lots of different styles of fruit growing, and that's something that you can look at to differentiate plants from each other as well. Like I said, blackberries and raspberries have kind of different fruits to them, similar but not exactly the same. The leaves are pretty similar. The stems are a little different. The fruits are a little different. So those are other types of things that we can look at. And sometimes you'll say, okay, this plant could be one of two things, but if the fruit is a berry, we know that it's it's not valerian. It's going to be the elderberry instead, or something like that. Obviously, if elderberry is to the point where it's fruiting, it's usually big enough that you can tell that it's not valerian and that it's a tree. So that might be a little bit of a silly example, but the fruits often look different. Even in some cases of closely related plants, there will be differences like the seed shape between dill and caraway, for instance. Dill and caraway are similar looking plants. There are other ways to tell them apart, but if you have the seed, you can tell that caraway has like a skinnier seed and dill has a flatter seed that's rounder. So often with that particular family of plants, the Apiaceae, which is also called umbelliferae, the carrot, poison hemlock, dill, parsley, Oshalomaceum, lovage family of plants. Sometimes the fruit or the seed is a way that you can tell them apart from each other. Yeah, and sometimes, if you find a vine that doesn't have any leaves on it, that's a woody vine out in the woods, you'll be able to tell whether it's poison ivy or bittersweet, partly by the fruit that's growing on it. They look very different. So learning what the fruit of a plant looks like, even though it's not there all the time, is one of the ways that you can tell plants apart from each other, one of the features you can look at. And it's just like kind of looking at a person's face. There's all these different features that come together that make a recognizable whole. And most of the time, you're not going to be looking at each of those parts in isolation. You're going to be looking at the whole thing together, and that makes it easier to recognize. So I wanted to talk about, any questions about plant anatomy before we go on to the materia medica section. All right, so this week I wanted to talk about two herbs, two plant medicines that if they were all you had to work with, you'd still be able to get a lot of work done. And I've said that about the other ones too, but that's what I'm going for with these first several classes, is things that are very safe and very versatile and very accessible. So the first one of these is probably the least accessible, or one of the least accessible things on that list of the early ones that I have in mind, and that is sesame oil. Sesame doesn't grow around here. You can grow it in your garden or something like that, but you won't get enough of a yield to make a lot of sesame oil. But sesame oil is a really wonderful, really versatile remedy. And it was not part of my family's tradition growing up, and it was not something that was used in the community that I grew up in. None of the stores, I don't think any of the stores where I lived sold it or anything like that. Probably would have had to come to Lexington to get it. But I first really started learning about what a wonderful substance sesame oil was when I was reading a book called Sushruta Samhita, which is an ancient Sanskrit text about medicine and surgery that was written in India several hundred years ago, over 1,000 years ago. And sesame oil featured in it a lot. And so I was, kind of thinking, this is a really fascinating thing that this person uses sesame oil for so many things. So to me, that sounded like it had a very home remedy kind of sound to it, but because I knew sesame oil as, something that you would get at the store, nobody, it wasn't part of my lived environment really. And when it was in my proximity at all, it was as a commodity, as something that was sold, and that's still true. But I'm including it here because it is pretty inexpensive, and it is something that you can do a lot with. So I'm going to start out with internally. Internally, sesame oil is really high in calories, and that's true of any oil. but it's fairly digestible because it's not from a grain. It's not something that has to be extracted using chemicals. You get some of the cheaper oils that you would see in the grocery store, like corn oil or soybean oil, which is sometimes just called vegetable oil for some reason. And I don't know if you've ever been around corn or soybeans or like had any of these things when they were fresh or seen them when they were growing. But one thing that I've noticed about them is there is no discernible oil in a corn kernel or a soybean. Edamame, fresh out of the steamer, it doesn't really have anything in it that you can recognize as oil. Not like eating, a walnut or something like that, where there's definitely oil in it. So that always made me a little bit suspicious. And when I learned about it, I found out that they were actually using chemicals, solvents, to extract the oil from inside the oil that's in them is basically in the skin of the seeds, and it's being extracted with chemicals. And so, like, okay, that doesn't sound like something to eat to me. That sounds more like, an industrial process of manufacturing. But sesame is more like peanut oil or walnut oil. It's just the seed is crushed and the stuff comes out of it. Olive oil you can find made in both of those ways. But sesame oil is usually just pressed, crushed, and the oil separates out. So it's pretty simple in how it's made, and it is the highest calorie part of the seed. So if someone is unable to take in a lot of calories, if someone is able to absorb a lot of calories, giving them sesame oil by mouth in a dose of about a tablespoon at a time with at least a few hours apart, you can get a few hundred calories in somebody in a day without having to take up any space in their stomach. And if somebody's very sick and has no appetite, that's sometimes helpful. I've heard stories of people rubbing oil on the skin as a way of getting nutrition into the system. I'm not sure that actually works. If it does, I don't quite understand how. There are definitely stories about it, but I'm not sure that I believe them, or that the outcomes were what the people felt like they were in those situations. But if someone is very nauseous or has no appetite, they may still be able to take a small amount of sesame oil or other oils. So it's nutritive in that way. And that's its main internal use as far as taking it orally. And that's something. But and it's going to tie into what we talk about with nettles too. Besides that, it's mostly used, well, if you give it to somebody in a larger dose than about 2 tablespoons at a time, it will have a laxative effect. And that's true of most oils too. Your body can only handle about 25 to 30 grams of fat at once. And if you do a little bit more than that, you're going to get oily stools, which tend to be very motile. They tend to come out very easily. And so if somebody is constipated, that's a gentle thing to try to get things moving. And that's something that's usually, if someone has come off of, if I'm taking care of someone who has come off of opioids, like if they've had surgery and they were on, morphine or Dilaudid or whatever in the hospital, and then they come home and they're not having bowel movements and they're not having any appetite because they're not having any bowel movements. Sometimes taking a little bit of oil for that can help to get things started. And it's a less dramatic and less intense thing to do than giving somebody an actual irritating laxative. It's kind of a step more dramatic than giving somebody a fiber-based type of thing. But fiber-based things, if they don't work the first time or two, which they often don't in that particular scenario, then they just make the person feel too full. And that's not, not what you want. It's the opposite of what you want. So, a few spoonfuls of sesame oil can really help with that as well. When it's used topically, it does a couple of things. One is that it kills funguses pretty strongly. I actually like sesame oil better than tea tree oil for fungal infections on the skin. And that includes candida, it includes ringworm, includes athlete's foot. All of that is stuff that that the sesame seeds contain oils that are resistant to fungal growth, because it's to keep the seed from rotting before it gets a chance to sprout. But if you're using the oil as medicine, it has a pretty strong antifungal effect when it's applied topically. And there are lots of scenarios where that's what you want. A lot of people use essential oils like tea tree oil for that sort of thing as a home remedy. The trouble with tea tree oil is it evaporates. Sesame oil is not an essential oil. It's a fixed oil. It's not volatile. It doesn't evaporate. It soaks in and just kind of stays there. So it has more staying power for something like if you think of athlete's foot, for instance, the fungus thrives on a damp, hot environment, like inside of a sweaty sock, right? And if you're putting tea tree oil in that situation, the heat is kind of going to cook it off. It's going to make it evaporate. If you're using the sesame oil, it's not going to evaporate, so it'll stay around, continue having its antifungal effect all day long. So that's a really nice thing that it does, that has a wide variety of uses, and is, often the sort of thing you might treat at home, often the sort of thing that if you do end up eventually setting up a clinical practice, it's something that people will come to you for. Had somebody come in today who had a family member had a rash that had been persistent for several weeks, and I never actually saw that rash. They, didn't bring the person with me. They came for something else, but they were like, "Do you have anything that we might try for this?" And I was like, "Well, go get some sesame oil and try that. If that doesn't work, bring them in here and see me." But they tried that and it went away right away. So, it's really useful for fungal itching or any itching that's caused by dampness and heat, or any kind of, it's not always itchy. Ringworm is often not itchy, but it's like a lesion on the skin. So it's useful for that. It's also what we call bacteriostatic. It's not real strongly antibacterial to the point where it would get rid of an infection, but it does keep bacteria from growing. So if somebody has a cut, scrape, somebody has a cut or a scrape or something like that, and you put sesame oil on it, it will keep it from, it will keep any bacteria that are already in the wound from really getting going, developing, and it will keep other bacteria and other irritating substances like dust from getting directly against the wound, because it creates a very thin barrier. So if you have a situation like, a good example is not too long ago, I guess it was last year, I saw someone who got cut with an axe. They cut their foot with an axe, a hatchet actually, and had a big laceration on their foot. And so I used a sesame oil based remedy on that, and then put something over the wound itself, and then taped the whole area up so that the skin would not be able to separate. The edges of the laceration would not be able to separate. And within 24 hours, the edges had kind of knitted back together, and it was, had gone from looking like a terrible gash where you could see through the layers of the skin and the fat underneath it, to just what looked like a scratch. It wasn't a scratch, it was a deeper laceration, but it looked very superficial once it had knitted together. And the sesame oil really helped with that, because it helps to create a barrier that allows for healing to happen at a faster rate. And it keeps the bacteria that might have been introduced into a cut like that from developing. You still want to wash it out with saline or some other disinfectant, but then the sesame oil is bacteriostatic, so it'll help with that sort of situation. There was a question about how long it takes to see improvement with athlete's foot. It's variable, and it depends on how bad it is. Probably the fastest that I've seen it is almost immediately, because there is some decrease in inflammation. And often with athlete's foot, you'll have a situation where there are very small cracks in the skin, and the sweat is irritating those. It's literally putting salt into a wound, and not only salt, but also uric acid and some other substances that are in the sweat. So the first thing that creates any relief is putting a barrier of oil over those cracks. And sometimes that reduces pain right away. And then the healing can start. And, depending on how messed up the skin is, that can take a month to really get all the way back to normal, or it can be much faster. But it starts killing the fungus right away. It starts sealing up those wounds and protecting them from the sweat right away. So, some things start happening right away. Some things can take up to a full skin regeneration cycle, which is about a month to happen. So kind of depends how bad it is, kind of depends how badly entrenched the fungal infection is. But with, what we usually think of as athlete's foot, that's usually not too deeply entrenched. Sometimes you get more severe versions of it, like toenail fungus is kind of a different thing, but it's often goes along with athlete's foot. And treating anything with the toenails takes a long time, because they're harder tissue and they just grow more slowly. They grow out more slowly. And so, the new toenail that's coming out will be better looking, but the gnarly looking misshapen part of the toenail will take weeks and weeks and sometimes months to grow out. Similarly, if somebody's been in a situation where maybe if they were in a war or something like that, and they were sweating in their boots for days and weeks at a time, you can get a more severe fungal infection that's kind of deeper into the skin, and that can take longer too. But most of the time, you're talking hours to days, maybe weeks, depending on what the level of involvement is. But a lot of symptomatic relief can be pretty much same day. So I use sesame oil a lot for wounds. In the book that I talked about, Sushruta Samhita, he talks about someone having their ear cut off and doing reconstructive surgery, and basically like making a new ear for this person out of the tissue around it, but using sesame oil to help the area to heal up. So, that's kind of more severe, more involved than what I've ever done with it, but it's someone's done it. And so it's a really good thing for just moisturizing the skin, protecting the skin. You can put sesame oil directly on the lips like you would with chapstick. Has the same kind of effect. Another thing, if people have dry sinuses or very dry eyes, actually you can put a drop of sesame oil right here, right where the tear duct is, and then just kind of blink to distribute it if you have a little dropper. So you don't have to put it in your open eye. You can just put it at the corner of your closed eye and then blink several times, and it'll spread it, and then move your eyes around, and it will actually lubricate the eyes. And and that can help a lot with protecting the eyes from pollen allergens, things like that, and protecting them from dryness, especially if you're having dry eyes as a result of like heated air in the wintertime. You can also put it up the nose. A lot of people kind of find the idea of spraying sesame oil up their nose a little bit daunting, but you can also put it on the end of your fingertips and put those against your nose, against your nostrils, and just breathe it in. And it will kind of coat the entrance to the sinuses and protect them from dryness as well. So it's something that can be used that way. It can also be used to wash out the mouth. If there are sores in the mouth, it can really help with those to heal. So if somebody has a lot of mouth sores, usually I will do something water-based to treat the mouth sores. Like, for example, you might use yarrow, since that's an herb we've already talked about. And that would help the sores to heal up, whether they're from, herpes, or whether they're from whatever. I've seen sores from people using smokeless tobacco. I used to work a lot with homeless people when I was also living on the streets myself when I was younger. And I worked with some people who had really terrible oral hygiene, and also people who smoked crack cocaine, which is very erosive to the mucosa in your mouth. So I saw some really terrible cases of mouth sores in that situation. And just rinsing the mouth out with something water-based that's for wounds, and then rinsing it again with sesame oil and spitting both out afterwards is really the most helpful thing I've found for getting sores inside the mouth to heal. Sorry if that's excessively graphic, or more than you had in mind when you logged on here today. Sometimes healing people is a pretty gnarly process, but one does what one can. So it's really good for helping wounds to heal all over the body, whether it's, basically any surface that you can get it to, it's going to be helpful. If you have sores like bleeding ulcers, again, I would use something that was specifically for bleeding, and I have, different herbs that I use for that. But then I would also use the sesame oil orally for that too, in most cases, because it tends to be very well tolerated, digestible, edible type of thing that also helps with healing.
Is it something that you would combine with, like, I guess if you're wanting to add it to like a salve recipe, or does cooking it or warming it mess with its healing properties?
No, you can warm it quite a bit without messing with its healing properties. There does come a point where it kind of burns or gets toasted and turns brown, and then it's kind of a different substance. But you can actually heat it quite a bit, and you can definitely heat it to the point of melting beeswax into it and making a salve, or adding other oils to it and things like that. It's a really good base for oil infusion, and we will talk more about that as we go along and as we get into medicine making, which is kind of the next big chunk after just getting to know the plants, is medicine making. So we'll be talking about that sort of thing soon, and when you might want to use sesame oil versus different oils. But when in doubt and you need an oil for something, it's a really good go-to oil. So that's why it's the first one that I'm introducing in that capacity. But yeah, you can definitely use it for all of that, and heating it to a temperature that makes it warm but doesn't make it smoke is definitely an okay thing to do. There was another question about can you use sesame oil for a systemic fungal situation that causes skin lesions? You can use it for topical treatment of the skin lesions, but it won't kill off the deeper fungal infection. So it won't really kill fungus that it does not touch directly. And it won't really get absorbed as is into your system to fight it systemically, but it can help with topical treatment. So that we'll eventually learn about some other antifungals that are better for systemic types of things. But for anything that you can reach with your hands, it's pretty helpful. And anything really in your digestive tract too, because you can deliver it directly to there. Oh. There was another question about vaginal yeast infections, and yeah, it'll work for that. It's pretty useful for that. Usually, if I were making somebody a compound for that, I would use sesame oil that it had some other antifungal stuff infused in it. But in lieu of getting into that level of complication, yes, you could use it directly topically for vaginal yeast infection, and also for oral thrush, which is kind of the same thing, but in the mouth usually happens in babies and in people who have dentures or other prosthetic type things in their mouth, or people with compromised immune systems. So it's good for basically any fungus that it can directly touch, that you don't want growing on your body. Also, it can be used for general skin health, like I said, just kind of moisturizing. It does have a little bit of an earthy smell to it. Some people don't like. I actually kind of think it smells nice, but if that's kind of a matter of personal taste. It can be used for the hair to moisturize and strengthen the hair and the hair follicles. Some people say it helps with hair growth. I think that it might under certain circumstances. It definitely isn't like the miracle way to regrow male pattern baldness or anything like that, but it is a lot of the time hair loss has an inflammatory aspect to it, and it does have a mild anti-inflammatory effect. So even if it's used on skin things that aren't fungal, sometimes that anti-inflammatory effect is going to be helpful for making the skin less irritated. So sesame oil is a real good one to know about. The other one I wanted to talk about is nettles. Nettles are actually more like a class of herbs or a group of herbs. The kind of stinging nettle of commerce is Urtica dioica. Urtica urens is also a species that grows a lot in Europe. There's also Laportia, which is wood nettles that grow here in the woods. Wood nettles don't have as much sting to them, but they do have some. I first learned about stinging nettles. Well, I'd heard about stinging nettles because they were in a lot of stories. They were in one story that one of the fairy tales that I grew up with involved the hero having a shirt that was woven out of nettle fibers, because you can like pound the stems into threads. If you pound the stem between two smooth rocks, it smushes away all the green juicy part, and what you're left with is these long threads that can be spun into like a twine type of thing. I don't think a shirt of it would be very comfortable, but it is possible to make fabric out of it, and it probably is possible to process it just like you can with hemp to get different levels of finer thread if you have the right equipment to do it with. I've made twine and cordage out of it, but not actual clothing. But so I knew about nettles from stories like that. I also knew about it from one story about a monk sorcerer type person called Milarepa, who goes into the woods and lives on nettles for a long time. So I knew just from the stories before I'd actually ever encountered the plant that it was very nutritive. So when I was about maybe around 10 years old or so, I was wandering out in the woods. I came to the river. I'm not sure whether it was the Kentucky River or the Sturgeon Creek, because it was somewhere near where the two come together. And I jumped in and I swam across the river. Well, I took off what I was wearing and I jumped in and swam across the river. When I got out on the other side, something was stinging me. And at first I thought it was these little bugs called no-see-ums that are just kind of like midges, small stinging flies, biting flies. And so at first I thought it was that, but then I realized that it was the plants that by that time I was standing in the middle of, because if they just brush up against you, they have these tiny little hairs on them that are just a few, they're like a almost microscopic structure on the surface, on the skin of the nettle, on the leaves and the stems, that injects some stinging stuff into your skin. So it really hurts. So, that was when I first learned to recognize them, first learned what they looked like. Most years I go and I harvest about 100 pounds of them, which dries out to about 20 pounds or so. They lose most of their weight in water when you let them dry. But nettles have a lot of different uses. You can cook them, even though they sting when they're fresh. When you cook them, they don't anymore. So you can cook them. Usually what I would do if I was cooking them is boil them just a little bit, then take them out of the boiling water and chop them up finely, and then cook them the rest of the way till they're soft. They're a really good green vegetable. They're very nutritious. You can just really feel the nutrients in them. You can also make tea out of them, which is really just the water that you boil the leaves in. But nettle tea contains some plant proteins. It contains a lot of minerals that the plants take out of the soil. It contains vitamins. So a lot of the stuff, all the stuff that's in nettle is water soluble. All that stuff that I just mentioned that's in nettle is water soluble. So it's like a different, completely separate set of nutrients than what is in the sesame oil. So nettle tea and sesame oil together, even though it's barely any food, can give you a lot of the nutrients that you need. Wouldn't want to live off of it long term, but it's a great couple of things to take when you don't have any appetite. So if you want to use it fresh, you can make it into, it's got some strong antihistamine properties. And we don't exactly know what all is in it that works as an antihistamine, but it has a tradition of use for allergies, and it contains several substances like quercetin that have been individually shown to have some anti-allergic effects. So a lot of people use either fresh nettle or freeze-dried fresh nettle or an extract of fresh nettle as an antihistamine. So that's another preparation you can make out of nettle. The sting itself is also medicinal, just like bee venom. It can be used to counteract certain autoimmune inflammation like rheumatoid arthritis. And the traditional way of doing that is to just take a nettle and sort of whip the area that has the swelling, whether it's a joint or whatever it is, with the nettle. And for some people, for some people, it just is irritating, but for some people, it makes it go away for years at a time. It can actually send a rheumatic flare into remission in some cases. And if you manage to do that, that's a huge thing for quality of life of the person that has it. And it might be that whatever is causing that to happen has some effect on the antihistamine or the anti-allergy process as well, because that is also the immune system causing undue unwanted inflammation. So it's nutritive. It's basically a biologic for some inflammatory conditions, and it's also an antihistamine. Tea or extract of the dried nettles is also really stimulating to the kidneys. So you can use that to make the kidneys work harder. It also, because it contains a lot of potassium, you don't lose potassium by taking it as a diuretic. So if you're drinking a lot of nettle tea and you're peeing out more than what you're taking in the tea because it's having this diuretic effect, and you're also supplementing with potassium at the same time, that can help get rid of sodium. That can help bring down blood pressure. It can help bring down fluid retention. It can help with heart function. So it has a whole range of different things that it helps with by being nurturing. And at slightly higher doses, it can have a little bit of a laxative effect too. So it's actually, going to be working on purifying the whole body by making the colon and the kidneys work a little more strongly. And then it's also going to be nurturing and decreasing inflammation. So, it's a very versatile herb that you could theoretically use in most situations, and it's a very safe herb. It's a very food-like, vegetable-like herb. It's okay to take during pregnancy. It's okay to take, with most other medications, as long as you're not taking it to the point where it's going to flush them out of your body. So it's a really wide-ranging, really safe herb, and it's something that, because it is a fairly large herbaceous plant that grows very abundantly in the places that it grows, it is something that you can easily gather as much of as you need for your family. You can go out and wear some gloves, have a basket or something to put it in, but you can easily go out and gather a big old bunch of it. And like I said, once it's dried, it doesn't sting anymore. Or if you cook it, it doesn't sting anymore. So that kind of daunts people. You wouldn't want to just pick it up and eat it fresh. I've done it before to see what would happen. Nothing terrible happens, but it does hurt. Nothing terrible happened in my case, but it does hurt. So, you don't want to just eat it fresh, but with just about any kind of preparation, whether it's making it into a tincture when it's fresh, or cooking it, making it into a tea, or drying it, it loses that ability to sting. So yeah, it's a really good herb to know about. So there's a question of whether I recommend growing nettle in the yard. Personally, I haven't had that much luck trying to grow it. It likes certain types of conditions, like maybe more sandy soil and shade than what I've ever had in my gardens. So, and like I said, where I live, it grows pretty abundantly. If I were going to grow it, I would probably try growing it in a container because I think I would have an easier time controlling the mix of the soil and making it more like the soil that it likes to grow in. Where I find it usually here, I often find it along the river, and there's lots of it. And so, like I said, it's something that I often will go and gather 100 pounds of, which is, it's a lot, but it doesn't even take all day to get 100 pounds of it if you go to a couple of good stands of it and, take a small portion of what's growing in each stand. So that would depend on what's around you and whether it abundantly already grows where you live and that sort of thing. I think that it would not be that hard to grow. There are definitely places that do grow it commercially and so forth. But my approach with that one has always been to gather it from the wild. So all nettles, yeah. Well, any of the urtica and laportias can be used like this. There might be some other things that have nettle in the name that I'm not thinking of that this might not all apply to. But the urticas and the laportias, they're all very safe in the kind of scenarios that I'm talking about.
I have a goofy question, sort of. I always
Yeah.
have goofy questions. um, so I know I have it where I live because I was walking through the woods and I felt it sting me,
Hmm.
but I didn't really, I mean, I just kept on walking, didn't think anything of it, but I don't really have that type of environment really that it likes where I was walking. Is there something else that stings kind of like it, or
I can't think of what it would be. Um, but I mean, it has a kind of a distinctive sting, but
I thought it was a bee, but it was not a bee.
but it's not. Yeah, that sounds like it, but I don't know. I'd have to see, but it might be that you have the laportia, that kind of the wood nettle that grows more under the trees in the shade, often
Okay.
on hillsides and things like that. I'm not sure though. I haven't seen the space, so it's kind of hard to say for sure. But if it felt like that, then that's probably what it was. It's not a real flashy looking plant. It has very leaf shaped leaves, and the flowers don't look like much of anything, and they're kind of hidden under the leaves anyway. Um, so yeah, it's kind
I've
of
literally been
an
walking up
easy
to
one to
things
miss.
that I've been walking up to things that I think it might be and like touching it, trying to see if it stings me. I'm trying to find him, having a hard time finding it. I know it's here and I want to find it because I feel like it would be great to have around, but um
Yeah,
I know it stung me, but I just can't find where it did it. I can't remember.
yeah. So there's questions saying, is wood nettle as beneficial? And yeah, I'd say it's pretty much the same. As far as using it to sting for joint pain, it's not as good. It doesn't have as much of a sting to it. Other than that, it's awfully similar. It's awfully similar. There's probably more of a difference in terms of growing conditions than there is between the two species. So there's probably, uh, more of a difference in the particular quality of an individual stand than there is between the two species or the two genera of nettles. So I use wood nettle a lot, and I really like it. All right, so oh yeah, you're gonna bring some. Somebody said they would bring fresh and dried nettle to the herb walk on Saturday. That would be lovely. So I want to talk a little bit about the herb walk on Saturday before we go. We're going to meet at 11 a.m. at Heisel Farm Park, which is just outside the north side of Lexington. Um, and this is a large public space. It's mostly mowed fields. Uh, there's about a 50-50 chance that it'll rain. If it rains, we get wet. And because this time of year in Kentucky, it rains some most days. And so you can't just always plan around it. But yeah, so maybe, be prepared to dress for rain or bring rain gear if you like that sort of thing. And also be aware that there might be ticks and things like that in the space. Uh, Snakes, maybe. Probably we won't see any snakes, or I don't know. I never see snakes out there. There are probably some garter snakes at the least, but I don't expect to see a lot of snakes. But be aware that there might be some. Be aware that there will be thorns. There will be the possibility of ticks, mosquitoes, things like that. So dress accordingly. And as far as temperature, this time of year in Kentucky, it could go either way. We've had in the last 10 days, we've had days where it was very, very hot and days where it was pretty cold. So I think that it's going to be a nice day, though, with maybe some scattered showers thrown in on top of that. But we'll be walking around some. I want to meet next to the barn. If you come to the parking lot, there's a big barn, and by the barn, there's some like little tables and stuff underneath the trees. We'll gather there and try to get there by 11 so that we can start heading out. I'm not going to try and Zoom the class while it's going on. I'm going to try and record it and then post it later, because reception out there is not necessarily good enough to not drop the connection. But there is some reception, so if you were to arrive late and wanted to text and find where we were, we could probably do something like that. But try to be there at 11, and we will head out into the fields from there, and we should see a pretty good mixture of early summer meadow type plants that will be good, not a lot of rare deep woods type of stuff, but a lot of common stuff that is really good to know as a beginner, and that is something that you can likely find in abundance in other places as well. So I'm really looking forward to doing this with everybody, and hope that as many of you as possible can make it. And if not, don't despair. We will get it posted to the YouTube channel as soon as possible. Yeah, that's 11 a.m. on Saturday. Somebody asks if I have a brand or preference for sesame oil. I usually use Eden brand sesame oil. I will mail out the address of the park, and should be around 2 hours. We should be out there for around 2 hours.
Is there sorry, this is Erin. Is this something that's appropriate? I have kind of young kids, but that I would carry around. Is that something that's inappropriate for this walk?
I'm fine with that. I think that it would be, it's okay for, it's a reasonable thing to do. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And I will see those of you who are coming on Saturday, and the rest of you, I'll talk to you next week. And if anybody has any last questions before we go, now would be a good time to ask them. Yeah, bring pressing stuff. Officially, no, but yeah, I think that, that I don't see much problem with picking a plant and putting it in a book to press it. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for coming, everybody, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. See you soon.